Welcome, educators. Welcome, educators. My name is Michelle Arnoux, and on behalf of Calvary Christian Academy and Schools United, I'd like to welcome you to this exclusive virtual session. We are blessed to have all you Christian educators joining us from across the country. Today, we have 3 dynamic speakers ready to share their expertise. Each will present for 15 minutes. Afterwards, there'll be a 30-minute Q&A session. Remember to drop your questions in the chat and the name of the speaker the question is directed to. Let's begin. Our first speaker is Brian Carruthers. Brian received a bachelor's degree in science education and a master's degree in educational administration and supervision from Bob Jones University. His educational doctorate degree is in social school leadership, which he received from Nova Southeastern University in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. He has 19 years experience as a teacher and administrator of Christian schools in Florida and North Carolina. Currently, Brian serves as the Dean of the School of Education and Human Services at Bob Jones University and is a member of the graduate faculty. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you, Michelle. It's such a pleasure to be with each of you this afternoon. This has been a great day as we've had the opportunity to celebrate Christian education and to see what the Lord is doing, both in the lives of our teachers and leaders, but also through them in the lives of young people. This afternoon, I want to talk just briefly about a paradox of the teaching profession. On one side, teaching is a profession that's built on lots of connections. You have connections with students, you have connections with parents, you've got connections with the community as a whole. So there's a lot of interaction that goes on in the teaching profession. But on the other hand, teaching has also been noticed as an isolating profession. And when I say that, it's because we are isolated. Teachers find themselves very isolated in the fact that they feel like they're doing it all by themselves. That the weight or the burden of teaching and working with their students rests upon their shoulders. And I want to argue this afternoon that one of the ways that we can overcome that isolation is by looking at a connection that maybe we ignore. And that is the connection of depending upon our colleagues, our other teachers, to support us and to help us in our profession of teaching. By supporting one another, by sharing our struggles, by lifting each other up, we create a culture of collaboration that benefits not just us, but our students as well. Because when teachers are supporting teachers, everyone is going to win. And so the title of my talk this afternoon is Creating a Culture of Professional Learning When Teachers Are Helping Teachers. Now, this whole idea of isolation in teaching may be one that you've not thought about. And yet I want to share with you just some interesting data that I've come across. There's a book that was published in 1975 called The School Teacher by Dan Lorty. And Dan Lorty describes teacher isolation as one of the main structural impediments to improved instruction and student learning in the American public school. Lorty argues in his book that teachers have worked behind closed doors, rarely if ever collaborating with colleagues on improving their teacher practices or examining student work. Now you say, well, that was back in 1985. What about recently? Well, there was another study by the Scholastic and Gates Foundations, and they found that only 3%, teachers spend only 3% of their teaching day collaborating with colleagues. The majority of American teachers plan, teach, and examine their practice alone. And I wonder, as you reflect upon your role as a teacher, maybe you feel like you're on that desert island. You're isolated. You feel like you've got everything that's on your shoulders and there's nobody out there. And especially if you're an elementary teacher, I'm sure you feel like this because you have the young people you're responsible for. They come in first thing in the morning, you're with them all day, you take them to the lunchroom, you take them to the playground, you take them to the bathroom. And all of that responsibility is on you. And yet there's other human beings out there, but you kind of see them off in the distance. Lordy goes on in his book, he says, and he's very graphic in the way he puts this. He says, each teacher spends his teaching day isolated from other adults. The initial pattern of school distribution many times represents a series of prison cells, the individual classrooms, which were construed as self-sufficient. Now, that's a pretty dismal situation, isn't it, that I've just described? But I believe there's a solution to that. I believe that we can get beyond that sense of isolation and we can work towards becoming more collaborative in the way that we approach our profession. So how do we resolve the issue? I believe we can change when teachers are empowered to provide instructional leadership within their school. Teachers who are given the opportunity to speak into the instructional plans, their professional development, and most importantly, holding each other accountable. That is a way for us to grow in our profession and to be a help and an encouragement to each other. I recently read a book entitled Time for Change, 4 Essential Skills for Transformational School and District Leaders. And it was interesting because the authors made, I thought, 2 very astute points. Number 1, teacher leadership can have a powerful, positive impact in schools. Notice it wasn't talking about administration, it wasn't talking about heads of schools, it was talking about teacher leadership and the positive impact that they can have on their school. A second quote from the same book, the author says, "Who better to convince teachers to consider new, possibly uncomfortable, yet necessary behaviors than other teachers who can relate and have experienced similar challenges?" And so it was these sentiments that really confirmed in my mind that many of our schools are not utilizing some of their greatest resources. And guess what those resources are? Those resources are the teachers, the men and women who are professionals and come to the classroom on a daily basis, allowing them to speak in to the role of what it means to be an educator and how to improve the professional programs at their school. Just one more piece of data to accentuate what I'm suggesting. I recently came across a recent Gallup survey regarding the K-12 teacher experience. That survey says that only 31% of teachers in the United States felt that they were actually engaged at work. And Gallup went on to say that greater employee engagement in your school or district will translate to better well-being, to lower turnover, and greater productivity. What do we mean by teacher engagement? Teacher engagement is a teacher's level of commitment, dedication, and involvement in their teaching. So what I would like to suggest, and really very quickly, 2 thoughts. 2 ways that we as teachers can really speak into growth and our professional development by working one with another. Number 1 is to model a culture of learning or to create within your school professional learning communities. Professional learning communities. I read an article, this was some time ago, it was in the New Yorker magazine. The author was James Surowiecki. And he makes this comment, he says, high performance isn't ultimately about running faster, throwing harder, or leaping farther. It's about something much simpler. It is about getting better at getting better. Just recently, we saw Super Bowl. We saw professional athletes that were at the top of their game, and they were competing to be the number 1 team in the United States as it comes to professional football. Now, for someone to be able to rise to that level, to be able to play at that level, at that game, they had to work hard. It was very deliberate on their part to show that improvement. And so it took a lot of work. It took a lot of intentionality. But I would like to suggest to you this afternoon that teachers need to have that same kind of mindset, that same kind of intentionality. In fact, there's a book that I'd like to share with you by Jonathan Eckhart. It's called The Novice Advantage, Fearless Practice for Every Teacher. And he makes this statement. He says, in the profession that makes all others possible, this notion has not always been embraced. Getting better at getting better means that we have to admit that we have a specific need for improvement, not in a generic sense, but in extremely specific and transparent ways. And what Eckhart is suggesting is that each of us as professionals, we need to take a step back. We need to look at ourselves and say, how can I improve? How can I become better as an educator? And then once we are transparent and we recognize those weaknesses, then we work together, we hold each other accountable, and we work to become better as a professional. And I believe that teachers who have that novice mindset are those who need to harness the knowledge and experience of others. We are not going to do this by ourselves and be successful. But it's when we lean into other professionals, our colleagues, and we ask for their help, their encouragement to speak into our professional lives, that is going to help us to be and create that professional learning community within our school. Now, how can we do that? Let's be very practical. I'd like to suggest there's 3 ways that we could create professional learning communities within your school. Probably the easiest one is just to develop a community with your school colleagues. It is getting together and maybe spending some time reading a book or maybe attending a webinar together and then having a conversation about what that information meant and how it can be practically applied in your professional life. And you may be sitting here right now and saying, I don't have time for that. I've got to grade papers and I've got to prepare my lesson plans and I've got to do all these things that are required of me as a teacher. And I get it. You know, being a teacher is a busy professional responsibility. And yet, can I suggest to you that we're not comfortable in going to a doctor who is not working at his top of his game, or hiring a lawyer who's not working at the top of his or her game. We want them to be totally trained and prepared and doing their best. And don't parents expect the same of us? And so can I encourage you that as you look at your professional work, that you are identifying areas where you can improve and you are rallying around the other teachers within your community and you are working together to be able to grow professionally and to strengthen yourselves. So number 1, school colleagues, administrators, teachers, instructional coaches, parents, students, having them to become part of the conversation that will allow you to grow professionally. Now, a second way to do this is to be able to go out beyond your school and to invite other knowledgeable others who can come in and speak into a particular issue. This could include former teachers, mentors, folks from higher education, state organizations, and professional organizations. But it could be as simply as having a professional library. A third way of creating such a community is being able just to share key research, curriculum, professional publications, blogs, idea generators, and so on. But let me summarize very quickly of why this is important. This is important because number 1, it encourages teachers to have a novice mindset. As Eckhart says in his book, it is a rawness of desire to know and learn and to become better at their profession. As a result of that, it encourages teachers to have intentional conversations about school improvement. What can I do to become a better teacher and to be able to work together to improve my school? That will cause intentional collaboration with knowledgeable others. It is picking the brains of other folks to have them speak into a particular issue that you may be dealing with. As a result of those conversations, it encourages you to create strategies that you can implement. And then ultimately, that is going to have a positive impact upon student achievement. So at a minimum, Can I encourage you as an educator to rally around your colleagues and to identify issues that need to be resolved, and let's work together to make that happen. But very quickly, a second idea that I want to share with you is what I call every teacher a coach. Every teacher a coach. It is creating a culture of success. Can I go back to the sports analogy that I used just a moment ago? This is another article by Resnick. In this article, the author says, no one expects an athlete to become great without a coach. An over-the-shoulder mentor who pushes and supports, watches and intervenes at critical moments, analyzes learner actions, and challenges them to become self-critical analysts of their own performances. And then the author makes this statement, which I think is really, really interesting. Just as we talk about the role of the coach, he says, just so with teaching. Just so with teaching. It is a demanding craft, requiring of its practitioners both careful planning and finely tuned adaptation to the flow of classroom activity and conversation. The teaching craft can be learned, but not from a textbook. It must be learned through guided practice. Can I suggest to you that all of us have room for improvement? We can improve. And yet it may be as simple as inviting somebody else to come into our classroom, to sit in the back of the room and suggest, is there a better way to do this? Is there something that you could be doing differently that you're not doing right now? Not in an evaluative way, not in a critical way, but as a teacher coming alongside a teacher and mentoring and encouraging and helping each other to be the teacher that they need to be. Unfortunately, many of our Christian schools, the concept of having an instructional coach that can come alongside a teacher to encourage and provide support is almost non-existent. School administrators do not always have the time or expertise to help the struggling teacher, and much less the teacher with a novice mindset that wants to improve. And yet, why isn't there a mechanism to help nurture students, our teachers, in their professional growth? Research indicates that such coaching can strengthen practice and give teachers confidence to try new things in their classroom. So very quickly, 4 thoughts and then we're finished. Number 1, instructional coaching is designed to move teachers from professional development, the stuff that teachers learn, to professional learning, deeper learning with application to the context in question. Instructional coaching provides a deeper understanding of the relationships between content and pedagogy and how they impact the teaching environment. Thirdly, instructional coaching is designed to meet the individual needs of a teacher rather than a group of teachers. And finally, instructional coaching is committed to be non-evaluative of the teacher, so the coach is accepted as a helper rather than an evaluator. Can I suggest to you, as we bring this conference to a close in just a little bit, that you leave and you have a desire in your heart that I want to be a better teacher, but I want to do that by coming alongside my colleagues and encouraging them and helping them. Let's do this together. Thank you so much, and looking forward to our continued conversation.
Thank you, Brian, for your encouraging and inspiring words. Our next speaker is Dr. Chris Yoakum. Dr. Chris Yoakum is currently the chair of the Department of Teacher Education at Fort Hays State University, where he leads a large teacher preparation program. With a comprehensive professional background spanning more than 2 decades that includes serving as a K-12 ESL and Spanish teacher, an education professor, and a university leader, Chris is dedicated to improving organizations and the lives of those within them by developing effective leaders. As the founder and CEO of CJ Leadership Solutions, he is also a sought-after speaker, trainer, and coach, having shared his expertise with leaders in pre-K through 12 schools, higher education, and the corporate space. An active member of his church, Chris goes on and serves on the worship team as both a guitarist and a vocalist. His forthcoming book, You Don't Have to Leave to Lead, a practical guide to teacher leadership, will be out in mid-2025. Welcome, Chris.
Well, thank you. Really appreciate that. And Dr. Carruthers, thank you for your talk. Really couldn't have planned the transition any better, because we just heard about the importance of building leaders within our school, of building a capacity, and the realization that I think we all understand, certainly those of you in what I call formal leadership roles, is that we are in the people business. And we must understand how we can relate to and form relationships with those we serve. Now, I know we would all like to think that in Christian organizations, everything is perfect and we don't have people problems, but we know that isn't always the case. And so what I have today and what I want to share with you are what I call my 8 relational realities of leadership. Now, because leadership is leadership, these are also things that I put in my forthcoming book. But when I've worked with leaders in higher education, other areas of K-12, and even outside of the education space, I feel confident that these will add value to you and those you serve. Because at the end of the day, in a word, leadership is influence, and we have to build relationships and understand others to develop those relationships. So I have 8 relational realities that I want to share with you in our time together, and hopefully you will be able to take something away. The first relational reality is what I call control yourself, influence others. And as you can see here, 2 things that I wanted to support this. Proverbs says a person without self-control is like a city with broken down walls. Galatians, but the Holy Spirit produces this kind of fruit in our lives: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. You see, at the end of the day, certainly in an educational setting, of all the great things that we get our students to do, we really can only control ourselves. And at best, we can influence others. Why do I say that? Well, one of the things that I want you to take away from these relational realities is I like to give you encouragement, but also permission, meaning encourage you with what I'm going to share, but also permission to realize that sometimes it's beyond what we can necessarily do on our own, and we need to rely on others or on other understandings. So the first one is control yourself, influence others. We can control ourselves every day, and we can positively, through our relationships, influence others. The second one, and I'm sure you have all found this to be true in your current professional settings, be it teachers, administrators, but it's disappointment is not detrimental. Now, why do I bring this up? Because I think a lot of us, with the best of intentions, certainly educators, we tend to be empathetic. And if those we serve are hurting, we are hurting. If they're upset, we're upset. But from a leadership standpoint, when we are leading students, certainly when we are leading other adults through teacher leadership or through formal administration, we have to understand that in and of itself, disappointment is not detrimental. Detrimental means harmful. Another way that I like to say this is adults are fully capable of being disappointed. Now we see here in Proverbs where it says, "My child, don't reject the Lord's discipline and don't be upset when he corrects you. For the Lord corrects those he loves, just as a father corrects a child in whom he delights." In addition, we have here in Romans, we can rejoice too when we run into problems and trials, for we know that they help us develop endurance, and endurance develops strength of character. So I hope that number 2 adds some value and encouragement to you, to let you know that as leaders, conflict happens every day. And part of addressing that is having the courage to understand that we have to, at times, disappoint others. But we do so in love, and we do so in a way to help them get better. We do so in a restorative manner. My third relational reality of leadership is that people reflect and project. I don't know if you have found this, but oftentimes when we are engaging, whether it's a difficult conversation or just interacting with other people, have you ever had somebody come at you in a way that was very hurtful? Now, I'm not here to say that people don't always act in ways that may or may not be intentional towards us, but I do think it's important from a leadership standpoint to understand that hurting people hurt people. What is inside, certainly when we are pressed and up against it, is what will come out. And so we need to realize that when we are in the people business, when we are influencing others, everyone from kindergartners on up to the adults we serve and those that serve the stakeholders within our school, is that oftentimes the way somebody responds to us isn't necessarily a reflection of us, but it's a reflection and a projection of what's inside them. Proverbs says that the face is reflected in water, so the heart reflects the real person. Luke tells us a good person produces good things from the treasury of a good heart, and an evil person produces evil things from the treasury of an evil heart. What you say flows from what is in your heart. Now, it's easy to say don't take it personal, but at the end of the day, what is inside, if it is not positive, will come out. Doesn't mean we can't pray for them, doesn't mean we can't show them grace, but I want to encourage you in your leadership journey to understand that oftentimes what is projected toward you is not because of you. Number 4 here, assurance through abundance. Now, if you think of the organizations that you have worked in, we always want to achieve something, whatever that goal is. And oftentimes along the way, that requires us to have small wins. And I think that's important. However, I want you to think about if you've ever been associated with an organization, be it personal, professional, where there was maybe perhaps this mindset of what I would call a scarcity mentality. Oftentimes in less than healthy cultures, we find this, where if person A wins, that means person B cannot. Another way to look at this is there perhaps is not enough pie to go around. What I encourage you to think about, and what I've encouraged the leaders that I work with to realize, is to understand and create a culture, base your relationships on assurance through abundance. Instead of a scarcity mentality, it is an abundance mentality. Everybody can win. There's enough pie to go around. 2 Corinthians 9:8 says that God will generously provide all you need. Then you will always have everything you need and plenty left over to share with others. The next scripture I'd like to share that supports this is John 10:10, which I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with. The thief's purpose is to steal and kill and destroy. My purpose is to give them a rich and satisfying life. You see, we have all we need in him. There is an abundance mentality inherent in our relationship with the Father. And I would encourage you to remember that and promote that in your leadership relationships with others. 5, take care, not a caretaker. You know, sometimes whether it's our students or the adults that we work with, while we care deeply, sometimes with the best of intentions, I think we can maybe overstep and feel like it is our job to be a caretaker. And while there are times, certainly with the youngsters, that we must do that and help with things and report things that cross over into the home life, certainly when we lead and work with adults, whether we're stepping into teacher leadership or administration, it's so important to set that boundary and understand we are there to love and care for those that we serve, but we are not their personal caretaker. The verse I'd like to share here is share each other's burdens, and in this way obey the law of Christ. And later on it goes on to say, for we are each responsible for our own conduct. Relational reality number 6 is narratives nurture notions. You know, of all the people that we have a conversation with on a day-to-day basis throughout our lives, I would argue that we talk to ourselves more than any other person. The other thing that I would tell you is oftentimes in the absence of fact, with the absence of data and fact, the best story wins. And how often have we told ourselves, we have a tough conversations coming up, and we tell ourselves it'll be far worse than it ever was. Or even our self-talk. We maybe are a little hard on ourselves and think lesser of ourselves than we should. You see, when we lead others, it's important to understand that not only in ourselves, but in others, because Our narratives nurture our notions. The story we tell ourselves oftentimes dictates how we behave. Another way to say this is we must recognize that the best story wins. So our relationships with others, as we serve others, will oftentimes be guided by the stories they tell themselves. So I encourage you in your relationships, have clear lines of communication, be transparent, and make sure that the self-talk and the notions, the narratives within your respective culture and climate are positive and accurate. Proverbs says, the first to speak in court sounds right until the cross-examination begins. Philippians 4:8 says, and now, dear brothers and sisters, one final thing. Fix your thoughts on what is true and honorable and right and pure and lovely and admirable. Think about things that are excellent and worthy of praise. A couple more here with my 8 relational realities of leadership. Number 7 is 2 truths, 1 reality. Now, we live oftentimes, I think, with the best of intentions in somewhat of a dualistic mindset, somewhat of a binary mindset, where if one thing is true, everything must be true. I'll give you an example. How many of us have had a colleague that maybe was great in the classroom and felt called and led to become a formal administrator, such as a principal, and for whatever reason, it just didn't work out? And have we ever thought, I really want to be honest with my friend. I really want to come alongside them and let them know, hey, are you struggling? I'm seeing some struggles. But they were such a good teacher. There's no way they can be struggling. Well, I like to submit to you that two things can be true at once. We have to understand that. Certainly, they're a wonderful human, a great person, a great friend, but just because they were great at one job doesn't necessarily mean that they will be successful at everything else that they do. We know this from working with students. Good people make bad decisions quite often. And just because we might have a colleague that we need to address conflict with does not mean 2 things can be true. They can be a wonderful human, but at the same time have made a poor choice. So I like to encourage you, when you are struggling, when you are thinking of maybe having difficult conversations, developing those relationships with those you lead, I want to encourage you to realize that 2 things can be true at once, and that's okay. In Romans, it says, for instance, one person believes it's all right to eat anything, but another believer with a sensitive conscience will eat only vegetables. Those who feel free to eat anything must not look down on those who don't, and those who don't eat certain foods must not condemn those who do, for God has accepted them. Who are you to condemn someone else's servants? Their own master will judge whether they stand or fall, and with the Lord's help, they will stand and receive his approval. Again, 2 things can be true at once. Finally, in the 8 realities, 8 relational realities of leadership, number 8 is autonomy allowed. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, certainly, whether it's in our classroom, our school family, we have rules, policies, we have expectations. That is clear. But how often have we unnecessarily, I know I have we unnecessarily become angry, told ourselves a narrative, a story that isn't true, because in our mind, somebody had the nerve to do something that we simply did not think they should do? Now, it may not violate any policy, but in our minds, we think, how dare they do that? Didn't they know that I fill in the blank? Well, as we strive to be better leaders, to serve others, to build those necessary relationships, what I have found in my life, and I hope this will add value to you, is we need to understand that they're allowed. They're allowed. Now again, we're not saying that our students are allowed to violate policies and go against the rules. No, we're not saying that. But oftentimes we get frustrated and discouraged with others when they do things that ultimately they're allowed to do. For example, but if you refuse to serve the Lord, then choose today whom you will serve. But for me and my family, we will serve the Lord. And then finally, for you have been called to live in freedom, my brothers and sisters, but don't use your freedom to satisfy your sinful nature. Instead, use your freedom to serve one another in love. So I hope that I have added some value to you, that as you go in your respective roles, as you go in your ministries that each of you are called to do in this wonderful profession, that these will add value to you as leaders, enable you to enhance your relationship and understanding with others. My contact information, I think, has been provided. I would love to answer any of your questions or connect with you. Thank you for your attendance. Thank you for your time, and God bless each and every one of you.
Thank you, Chris. That was very valuable. Our final speaker is Natalie Talpesh. Natalie Talpesh is a licensed clinical social worker and works as the school counselor for the 9th and 10th grade girls at Calvary Christian Academy, Fort Lauderdale. She earned her bachelor's degree from the University of Florida, go Gators, and a master's degree from New York University in clinical social work. Part-time, Natalie serves as a counselor for the Sheridan House Family Ministries. She is married to Danny Talpesh, the middle school assistant principal at Calvary Christian, Fort Lauderdale, as well as her daughters attend CCA. Her unique training in mental health helps equip the dialogue with families when it comes to students struggling with anxiety and/or depression. In her free time, Natalie likes to travel and go on adventures with her family. Welcome, Natalie.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. I'm coming off some February flu-sounding laryngitis, so thank you for bearing with me. I am Natalie Talpesh. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I've been working the last 7 years here at Calvary Christian Academy, primarily with 9th and 10th grade girls. And my conversation with you today is a little different. I really would hope to give you some strategies to work with students on the field, how to support their emotional well-being, their mental health, and just some practical tips that we can hopefully take away from this time together. So I had the privilege of going to the MIT Brain Institute post-COVID, and there was some data that came from Dr. John Grabelli, and he was a big mental health proponent, and he was looking at the research, and he says, right after COVID, and maybe this has gotten a little better, but I can say, just being a school counselor, and maybe you've noticed this in your schools, we seem to have so much of a jump in anxiety and in depression. In adolescents, they were seeing pediatric anxiety cases in the ER. They were seeing an increase in suicidal ideation and attempts. 1 in 3 females in high school say they felt sad and hopeless. And the statistics were quite alarming. And so, you know, this mental health is such a buzz. It's all over social media. The kids even know diagnoses. They know what to look for. A lot of times I have to tell students, no, social media cannot diagnose you. You need a mental health professional or a doctor to diagnose you. Mental health, though, impacts everyone's ability. So it's our emotional, psychological, and social well-being. It affects everything from how we think, feel, and act, right? And then there's this idea of stress, which is when we're feeling overwhelmed, unable to cope with some of the everyday pressures. Now, we all face stress, and stressors are a very normal and natural part of life. But mental health issues and concerns are kind of a combination of our genetics and chronic stressors, maybe traumas that have affected the brain's ability to cope with these things. Mental health issues are persistent. They last longer than 6 months. They are causing severe impairment, usually at school and at home. And so while stress can help us feel overwhelmed, if it's not managed properly, it might create some mental health issues, but they're not the same thing. And we want to kind of make sure we are empowering our students to know that if you're feeling stressed, it doesn't necessarily mean you have anxiety and you're kind of in this mold of a diagnosis. And our mental health fluctuates, day by day, and that's normal. We could feel happy, when we wake up and excited, and then we get some bad news and we feel a little bummed, or later we see a friend and we're kind of happy again, and it kind of goes up and down. So what are some threats to emotional or social, emotional, and health for our students. So one is if they really truly are struggling with depression or anxiety. Are they being bullied? Is there an actual situation where people are targeting them and they're feeling an injustice? Is there cultural or societal pressure or social media? There's so many conflicting voices. These kids want to be trendy. They want to do all the latest things, speak the way their peers speak, and there's a lot of pressure from them from society. Family dynamics, they go home to parents and siblings, and we don't know what happens sometimes at home. They might tell us, they might give us a view into their life at home, but there's things going on we don't see on the day-to-day. What about high achieving academics? So I work with high school students, and there's a lot of pressure to get into a good college, get a good education, and that's a wonderful thing, but sometimes that pressure can be quite overwhelming. Pressure of having honors and AP classes. My colleagues and I were kind of talking about how we've noticed kids just seem to share like, hey, I'm taking antidepressants, or hey, I'm seeing a therapist. And while normalizing maybe that seeing a therapist is okay and that's fine, we don't want it to become their identity, that they become their mental health, or that it becomes this trendy thing. We want to make sure that we're operating in a way that uses good judgment. And so one of the risk factors I do want to talk about, because we do see this, is the idea of bullying. And bullying is a major risk factor to mental health. And we see it on the news. Children, a lot of times, that have died by suicide were being bullied, and parents will share. There was this social media stuff going on, and things were happening at school. But we don't want to also call everything bullying, right? And there's a range of what is normal social developmental stuff. He said, she said, they did this, right? So we, at our school, defined what bullying is, and we made a policy around bullying. And so we defined it as systematically and chronically inflicting physical hurt or psychological distress on someone. It is unwanted, repeated, whether it's written, verbal, or physical. It can include threatening, insulting, and dehumanizing gestures. It could be by an adult or a student, and it's pervasive enough to create an intimidating, hostile, or offensive education environment. So what we normally see is that this is repeated. It's intentional. Sometimes there's an imbalance of power. The student feels they can't come forward because maybe that popular kid is going to taint their reputation and, kind of hold them under. So they feel that they can't come forward. So we have this policy in place. We have consequences. We don't tolerate bullying. A lot of times it's enough for us to pull kids in and have a conversation with them and provide scripture talking about what is gossip. You don't have to like everybody, but you do have to treat people with respect. You do not have to say ugly things about people. And a lot of times that's enough to really curb it. Thankfully, we don't see a lot of this, but it does happen in middle school especially. So this is just something to keep your eyes and ears on. And I think there's this tendency sometimes where we're like, they got to just figure this out on their own. And sometimes they do, but sometimes they need us to step in and be that voice and support that student. So that's one area to kind of look out for. The other thing is there's some symptoms to watch for. So if you're like, I don't know if a student of mine is struggling with their mental health, how do I know if this is just normal teenage stuff or the kid's just tired, right? What am I looking for? So we're looking for things kind of as big picture context, right? So maybe they're very irritable and angry. That could be signs that something's wrong. There's changes in behavior. So if you had a kid who used to be very engaged in the classroom and now is totally disengaged and withdrawn, that's definitely something to pay attention to. I had a boy just this week, and I walked up to him. We were in Bible classes talking about college planning, and I said to him, you look a little disinterested at the end of class. And he said, I am. I just want to be home. And so now that prompted further discussions as to why that would be the case. What's going on with him? Is there trouble at home? Trouble sleeping? Maybe they're not sleeping well. Are they neglecting responsibilities? Do we see any eating changes? Sometimes students stop eating. We've had students that Friends have pointed out, hey, they're not eating like they used to. Their hair's falling out. They're not feeling good. Something went wrong. Getting sick more often, especially with little ones, you'll hear a lot of complaints about headaches, stomach aches, just not feeling very good. And then, of course, if in a severe case, you're going to have self-harm and suicidal ideation, where they might express that they're thinking of hurting themselves, or maybe someone came forward and said, hey, our friend showed us these marks. It looks like they're cutting themselves. And this is when we really want, whether it's in our case, we use a school counselor. If you don't have a school counselor, that could be a nurse in your school or an administrator, where we do assess for self-harm. And you know, there's this misconception that we don't flat out ask children because we'll plant the seed in their head. Well, chances are is they've already thought about it. You know, they can Google things so easily now and know so much. So we do want to flat out ask them, do you have a plan? What is your plan? Have you been cutting yourself? With what? When are you doing that? How often are you doing that? Have you told your parents? We want to ask as many questions as we can. So know your school policy, that's one thing to do. We like to give a written notification to parents, and I will show that in the next slide, where it just kind of shows this is what goes home. We give them a self-harm fact sheet. We create a safety plan for them at the school that could look like they're not carrying scissors. When they're feeling those thoughts, they go to me, one of their school counselors, or the nurse. Do require the student to be seen by a licensed mental health professional or their pediatrician, and notify the administrator, and make sure you're documenting as well. Do not tell parents you don't think they'll hurt themselves. We never want to assume that this child is not at risk. We stick to the facts. This is what Johnny said. This is what he told me. This is what his friend said. And definitely do not minimize a student's feelings around this. We have a tendency to want to silver line things and say, okay, life's not that bad. We want to do that, but we don't. That's where we don't want to go. We want to stick with them. We want to stick with how they're feeling. We want to empathize with them and hear what they have to say. A lot of times, students in this position are not feeling heard. They're not feeling understood. They don't even know why they feel this way. So we really want to come alongside them so that they feel safe. On the next slide I have, this is our self-harm notification that goes home to parents. We have the parent sign basically saying, I've been notified that my child has expressed self-harm. Either they're actively doing it or they're thinking of doing it, so either one. And we have them be seen by a licensed mental health professional before they can come back to school. We actually send them home. So this is a policy you might want to talk through in your schools and see what kind is going to work best. So what I do want to talk about too is just this idea of, you know, when we're working with these students in front of us and we say, okay, I know this child is struggling. I know something's going on, but what do I do? How do I fix this? How can I meet them there? It's important to kind of educate ourselves and also them of the mental health concerns, but also the biology of the brain and what's going on. So many times I have to tell myself that a student's frontal lobe and their executive functioning, they're in the front, and we've talked a lot about that in this conference, is basically this idea that it doesn't really fully develop till they're 25 for women and a little bit later for boys and men, about 28. So sometimes I'm like, okay, I have to be this for them. We have to make wise decisions for them. They don't have the working memory, reasoning, and problem solving at their full capacity. They don't have the full emotional regulation, yet they're still developing these things. And so in the biology of stress, you know, when we're stressed, and I know this word triggered has become very politicized, right? Everything's a trigger, and I don't know about you, but I'm like tired of hearing it. Everything's a trigger, but just this idea of we have a tolerance. We have a window of tolerance. And sometimes students are so overwhelmed by all the work. At least I know for my students, they say, Mrs. Talpish, I have 8 blocks of classes. I have sports till 8 o'clock every night. I'm worried about college. I'm very overwhelmed and I'm very stressed. So we have to remember that that blood from the front of the brain goes all the way to the back to the amygdala, and we go into that flight fight or freeze response. And sometimes they lose their ability to process, to think well, to make good decisions. And so I think just knowing that is really helpful for us, but also even explaining that to them, that when they're coming in your office and they're crying or they're in the class and you just can't pull them together, they can't access those resources and skills. So what do? The best way to do it is to kind of change the senses and what we bring in. So we want to stay very calm and we want to co-regulate with them. And if you have children, you remember when we have a newborn, we do skin to skin, we put the baby on our chest and we breathe and they help regulates their temperature and their breathing. Well, we can't do this with a grown kid, but we can stay calm. We can have eye contact. We can touch their hand. In my office, sometimes if I have a student that's truly hysterical, I dim the lights, I turn some music on, because we want to now engage the 5 senses, because that's how we get that blood flow out from that back brain to the front. We definitely want to validate how they feel and not minimize how they feel. We do some breathing with them. How can I help? What do you need right now? Can I get you some water? When they calm down, when they regulate, we want to point them back to Jesus and of course, find the identity in him. I had a student yesterday who's struggling with a particular teacher. The style doesn't work for her. It's her math class. And one of the things we talked about was that you're going to face other situations like this. You're going to face other teachers that you don't understand or don't learn from. We need you to be okay with everything else around you not being okay. And so that's that identity in Christ and praying and encouraging with scripture. But to de-escalate that brain, we can use things like mints, music, smells, weighted blankets. I know a lot of teachers have fidget spinners and fun things in the classroom. Some joke books or pictures just to kind of calm their brain. Teach them some freeing up the space in their brain. So teaching them, what do we need to remove off our plate today to make this day more manageable, or this week? Sometimes we need to look at our schedule and talk to our parents and say, okay, I need to cut back on karate, and instead of going 5 days a week, I'm gonna go 3 days a week because it's too much. And I think, Dr. Yoakum did a great job of talking about the idea that 2 things can be true, and that was something I was going to share too, is that I could be unsure about, this math lesson or these math concepts, and I can still be a wonderful student. And so sometimes I tell the students, like, both of those things can coexist together. I can feel super anxious today, but I got dressed and I'm here and I'm gonna make the most of my day. And after I calm down and give myself a few minutes to do some deep breathing and kind of regulate myself, I'm gonna get back up and I'm gonna go back to class and I'm gonna face the day. And part of that is helping them change those thought patterns that kind of come in, that they can flip the channel on their brain and they can change what they're thinking about. So that was another verse I had too, is, just fixing your thoughts on what is true, honorable, right, and pure, lovely, and admirable. And so we want them to refocus their thoughts, and that's something we can definitely work with them on for sure. Box breathing. So I definitely a lot of times will walk a student through, and I know you're busy in the field, so it may not be practical for teachers to do this. But if you have a school counselor or nurse, that if a student is truly escalated, that they can do a few breathing exercises with them, a visualization. Sometimes we do safe space with our students, and a lot of times middle and high school students seem to visualize their room a lot. A lot of times their room feels like a safe space, and they walk me through what's in their room, what's on their bed, what's on their wall, what are they breathing in? And then I bring them to some scripture, and Jesus is with you right now, and what does that feel like when he's telling you that he's got you and he loves you? And then we pray. And usually after doing that for 5 minutes, they're a different kid and they can kind of face the day. So these are some strategies that we can implement to help kind of deactivate that brain. But the anecdote really for our mental health is this idea of frustration tolerance, building up grit and resiliency. That's really the antidote. And so we try to also educate the students that this is what we need to do, which means I'm going to face trials. I'm going to face things that are not fun. The Bible talks about this, right? So reframing these trials as healthy things. James says, count it all joy when you face trials. So how do we do this? We build connections. Do they have support networks in place? Are they making good friend choices? Is their family home life healthy? Where are those relationships that fill their cup? And how can we help foster those things? At Calvary Christian Academy, we have something called small groups. So students are placed in a small group once a week with their friends, and they have a leader that helps them grow. That just fosters those relationships and connections. Setting boundaries, I often say, guys, we are human beings, not human doings. We need to abide in Christ, and we're not robots. We can't do it all. I can't do 8 clubs and 3 sports and AP and all these things. I have to find balance and find some boundaries so that I have my life order priorities. I have Jesus, my family, my academics, and then everything else, right? So we have to find that order and those boundaries. Being open to change and really listening to our students. I think sometimes they really are wise and they know what they need, and maybe talking with their families and kind of brainstorming together of what that looks like, setting realistic goals for them, and identifying what those options could be like. Like I said, I've had students cut back. I remember one time I had a very high achieving student. She's actually graduating this year, but her sophomore year, she had a few honors classes and 3 AP and volleyball. And she said, Mrs. Talbush, I think I overdid it. This was the first couple weeks of school. I need to cut back on one of these AP classes. I said, great idea. So we were able to tweak things. So this is the kind of thing where we're building resiliency, supporting their mental health, and walking them through these hard things. And it's definitely takes a village, so we all work together, can brainstorm. And if you can educate your teachers and staff about this, we can work together to do it. So we'll leave you with this last quote. When the internal and external voices whisper the lies, you're insignificant, you're not enough, you don't measure up. We want our children to know deep in their souls, the only one who gets to define them is the one who created them and calls them beloved. So just keep pointing them back to Jesus. Also have a counseling referral page maybe in your school and some resources for parents. And I think that's a way to support our children. So I'm gonna invite my co-host up, and we are gonna do a question and answer panel for you. Thank you.
We just want to invite our virtual audience, if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat and who you'd like to address the question to. We have a few minutes, so I'm just going to give it a few minutes and see if there's any questions. Thank you, Addie. Yes, it's question time. We just have a few more minutes. If you have a question, I'd love to turn to our panel. Okay, we do have a question for you, Natalie. What is the best advice you could give to a smaller school on how to train admin and faculty to recognize and address bullying? And this comes from Jared at Cornerstone Academy in Gainesville, Florida. Go Gators.
Go Gators. Yes, thank you, Jared. I think that's a great question. How do we train our admin of a smaller school to recognize these mental health needs? I definitely think providing resources for them. I think if you're able to put something like this together, can share our PowerPoint, share these are the things, these are realities of what we're facing. We see these mental health struggles. We need to talk about a plan in place. We need to be trained on how to handle these things. Teachers can definitely be trained to notice symptoms and refer. And we don't have to necessarily treat. We don't treat our students for mental health, things. But I definitely feel that a lot of us are very competent in assessing and referring. And so I think starting that dialogue is very important. So definitely, you can do it, and we encourage you to do that.
All right, thank you. We have another question from Jennifer Williams, Heritage Christian School, Indianapolis, Indiana. Could you explain more about box breathing, Natalie?
Box breathing. So great question. Box breathing is you take your finger and you create a box, and as you draw the box going down, you breathe in. As you go to the right, you breathe out, then you breathe in again, and then you breathe out again. So they're creating a box, and a lot of times I have them do this like on their thigh or on their desk, and this is something they can kind of do discreetly, even in class when they're feeling a little bit flooded and overwhelmed by the emotion, but it just kind of helps regulate the breathing.
Thank you, Natalie. To all of you, we heard that everything was so helpful. And also we have another question from Catherine Curry, also from Heritage Christian School. What are ways we can set up our classrooms to de-escalate the brain, lower lights, less stimulation?
Great question. How do we set up our classroom to do stress the brain? Absolutely. Lighting makes a big difference. So I definitely talk to administrators about what that looks like in your space. We do have teachers here that use like twinkle lights, low the lights, sound. Sometimes you can have like an ocean or a sound machine on if it's low and it doesn't impact your teaching. That could work. Scents, so you can have something calming like lavender kind of there, or like little beads that you can put with the smell, so that way if kids are sensitive, they can smell it if it's the one kid that maybe needs that. Mints are okay usually for us. We do not allow gum, but we do let them have mints, so some teachers might have that for their students. But definitely creating that space. We even have some beanbag chairs. I know elementary has little balls that they can sit on if they need to move or just kind of get some of those jitters out. So definitely creating a space where they feel safe is definitely a win.
Okay, we have another question for Natalie. What are some ways to equip parents in these strategies and make them aware of the mental load on their children?
Such a great question. So I think it would depend on the situation for the child. Is the child stressed because of home life? Is it school life? Is it pressure from the school? A big one I face, and just quite frankly, is social media. I talk a lot about social media with parents and about them having parameters around it, and I provide resources for them, whether that's clips. We have Social Dilemma out on Netflix. There's a lot of literature out there, and so kind of showing them, here's what happens to the brain. This is what the impact is on their development. We actually host courses like that here for parents. So if you wanted to put something together for your parents, maybe once a year where they came in and you shared that with them, I think that would be really empowering for the parents to know just what actually is going on in the child's brain.
Okay, Natalie, here's another one. When a student is not meshing well with a teacher, like the one you mentioned, what are some encouragements that you share or ways to help them get through that class? Do you work with the teacher and the student to go and work together through it?
Absolutely, great question. When teacher and student are not meshing. So I think if they're young, I definitely think this is a space where parents, we still want part of that dialogue. I work with mostly high school students, so a lot of times I will empower the high school student if they feel safe, if they are confident to talk to the teacher on their own. If they don't, a lot of times I will step into that space and have a meeting with the teacher and the child and kind of help facilitate that conversation, a little bit like mediation in a way. And even if the teacher, and personalities make a difference. So sometimes I have teachers that are very strong personalities, and it's helping them find their empathy for this child, even if they think the child's making an excuse, because I think sometimes they feel like, oh, this is another excuse. And there might be validity to that, but it's pulling through to the child of where their accountability is, how they can approach the teacher in a kind way, and how the teacher can kind of reach the child where they are. And it definitely is brainstorming, but I would definitely step into those spaces and have those conversations.
Okay, I have 2 last questions. This next one is for you, Natalie. It says, you mentioned that when a student expresses thoughts of self-harm, to go ahead and ask follow-up questions and not fear opening a can of worms. Can you clarify who should be having that continued conversation, and should parents be a part of that convo?
Great question. So typically at our campus, I am a licensed clinical social worker, so I do feel comfortable asking those questions, and maybe some of you don't. So I would hope that maybe someone on the school property has a little bit of training around that and can ask those questions. But we actually ask them before we call parents, and we tell parents the facts. We tell them exactly what the child says. I tell the child, I have to call your parents. We love you. We want to protect you. This is keeping you safe. These are the times when we, are going to go against your confidentiality. It's if you're going to hurt yourself, somebody else, or someone's hurting you. Those are the 3 things. And to definitely do not be afraid to ask, even if you have no training. If you ask and they are telling you, yes, I'm thinking of hurting myself. Yes, I cut myself with a knife or a razor. Or yes, I think I would be better off dead. This is definitely, it's great that you're asking this question, and God is using you in those moments. So definitely you're gonna say, I love you so much. I'm so proud of you for sharing that with me. And because I love you and I wanna take care of you, we're gonna have this conversation with your parents. And we definitely bring them into that space.
Okay, I'm sorry, that's all the time that we have. We want to thank our virtual audience for tuning in with us. We hope you enjoyed the session and these dynamic panel members. Thank you, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.